In recording the session now. We're happy to have you all here. Just a reminder of etiquette. I think everybody has done this long enough now that you know to mute yourself if you're not speaking. We can also use the chat room for questions, or I think it's a small enough group that you can probably ask questions just by unmuting yourself this evening. We're happy to have you. This evening's presentation is from Aaliyah, and so she'll be making her presentation. Just as a little background, each year we have an annual leadership breakfast early in the year, January. It happened to be February this year, for neighborhood leaders and PTAs and business associations. And so Aaliyah presented there, and we thought it was worth bringing her back again to do a general session for the general public and to just check in with neighborhoods to see how things were going. And then after her presentation, we'll take questions. We're also interested in any success stories you've had about diversity, equity, and inclusion in your neighborhood and efforts that you've made. And then at the end, we'll also do our NBN Academy evaluation that we normally do for NBN Academy courses. I want to introduce Aaliyah this evening. She's a proud graduate of Hampton University. I think Zamari is also a graduate of Hampton University. Is anybody else a graduate of Hampton University? I can't see you if you're raising your hands, but we know that two of you are. And then Aaliyah also has her master's from Eastern University in the Philadelphia area, right, Aaliyah? And she started in economic development with the city of Norfolk, and she's moved to the city's chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. And what I've appreciated in the few years that we've worked together is that Aaliyah brings a contagious enthusiasm to what she does, but she also brings a very profound practicality to what she does, whether it was in economic development and working with the business cafes to get small and minority-owned businesses resources and connect them with the resources that they need to grow their businesses, or in her new position in promoting these kind of things across the city. These are things that have been talked about at the abstract level for years, and it's encouraging to see it being put into practice slowly but surely in the city of Norfolk. So I will turn it over to Aaliyah. Thanks, Aaliyah, for joining us this evening.
Can you hear me now? You can hear me? Okay. All right, so I'm having a bit of connection issues. So I am speaking to you from my cell phone while I'm looking at you guys from the computer, okay? So we're just having some connection issues. So if it looks a little crazy on my end, it's because I'm holding a phone while trying to kind of walk through this material. So bear with me, guys. And if at any point you feel like you can't hear me, you can, wave your hand or something, because I'm not hearing anybody else. Jim, could you just try to say something really quick? I just want to see if I can still hear you while I'm speaking on my cell phone. And this is more so just for me. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Okay, that was great. All right, so I'm going to pull up my presentation. Give me 2 seconds, everyone. Here we go. I'm going to share this. We'll do a slideshow. All right, and so for today's conversation, I want to talk a little bit about advancing equity with intention and influence. And so I want that to kind of drive our conversation today. And what I'd like is if you guys have questions or comments, I encourage you to kind of share throughout the presentation rather than feel like you have to wait to the end. Let's make this as conversational as possible so it can just be as impactful as it possibly can. And so the goals for tonight's session, I just want to review what we discussed during the NBN Leadership Breakfast. I also want to give one very important update on Norfolk's DEI efforts. I want to talk a little bit about being intentional about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to also just briefly talk about this idea of being a neighborhood influencer and what that would really mean, and a charge I want to give to everybody that's on tonight's call. So if everybody remembers, when we presented back in January, we really were talking about this idea of the positive pivot, right? We went through a lot in 2020, and so many things changed, right? In our world, they changed within our city, they changed within businesses and in schools and just everything that we did, right? And so we've all had to make these pivots. And so we talked a bit about that during the previous session, and how there was an old way that we did business and there's a new way, right? There are many events that happened in 2020 that really were a shift for our country. But I wanted to make sure everyone knew that the city of Norfolk was already ahead of the curve on that, right? We weren't waiting for the events that happened last year. We were already thinking, how do we advance equity in the city? How do we make sure that we are creating opportunities for everyone? How do we make sure that we are having conversations around creating opportunities, creating economic opportunity for everyone? And so how do we let that drive everything that we do? Those were conversations we were having before our pandemic, right? And so the old way was already out the door for us, and there was already a new way that we were existing and operating in the city of Norfolk. And so one of the things that we originally came up with when we recognized that we needed to have diversity, equity, and inclusion as a focus for us was we really wanted to make sure that we had a statement that we put out that kind of identified and was inclusive of everyone, and that this statement really started to drive all of our efforts, right? That the city wants to be inclusive of everyone, and we made sure that we tried to include everybody so that they were represented in this statement. And again, I'll make the same charge that I did at the leadership breakfast. If you don't see yourself, or if you don't see a neighbor represented in one of the things that we have listed here, if their demographic is not reflected in what we have here, let me know, because we want to be knowledgeable of that. We want to make sure that we are learning from our neighbors and that we have an inclusion statement that really does include everybody. And so for us, this is not like this is our stamp, this is our statement, and we're not willing to change. We are very willing to change. We're willing to evolve the same way our country is evolving. And so this is our current statement, but really want to encourage you that if you see something that's not reflected here, let us know so that we can update this to be reflective of our neighbors. And again, just for clarity and so that we're all on the same page, these are just our working definitions of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is for us and what it means to us, right? And so that real sweet spot for us really is related to equity, right? And that's making sure that those who need more, those who need the most, those who have been left out of conversations, those who haven't been considered, that we are considering them, that we are making decisions with them in mind. And so I always go back, I don't know if you guys can still see my video with me sharing my screen, but I always go back to that image of if somebody started right here and someone else started right here, equality would say that you give both of these people the same thing, which means this person always still has more. But when we're using equity and when we're advancing equity, we're saying those who need more, those who need unique resources, those who need additional support, those who need additional financial support, whatever it may be, we provide that so we start to level the playing field. Because one thing that we know that is very true is in many cases, the person who was up here, there were some other supports that were provided, and they may have been provided historically for this person that allowed for them to be right here while somebody else was right here. And so for us, equity is really acknowledging the disparities and the disadvantages that exist in our country, and specifically in our city, and really saying that those who need more to be successful, we need to figure out what our role is as the city of Norfolk to provide that so that folks can be successful. And so this is our commitment. I won't read it all to you, but I will just highlight a few of the pieces here. The second one, we strive to understand individuals and communities and where they are coming from. And I'll dive into that a little bit further along in the presentation when I talk a little bit more about this idea of belonging and creating a sense of belonging for everyone. But one way that you start to create belonging is by making sure that you understand individuals and you understand the communities and where they come from. Another one I want to highlight is the fourth bullet: citizens and neighborhoods receive services and programs from the city objectively and equitably. And so we're really doing the inner work that we have to do within the city to make sure that our delivery of services really is equitable and it's fair for everyone. And so this is our commitment as the city of Norfolk. And again, just reinforcing this idea of equality versus equity. And for us, it's all about equity. It's about providing those what they need so that they can be successful. And for Team Norfolk, it really is everyone's job. And so we're really doing the work to figure out, what does it mean for all of our staff for equity to be their job? And so that's what we're working to figure out internally, so that that is reflective in all of the services and everything that we do for you guys as our neighbors and as the citizens in this city. And just as another refresher, it's so important for us to understand our history. There's a lot that has happened in our country. When we look at the demographics of our neighborhoods, when we look at the makeup of our neighborhoods, there is so much that has happened from a policy perspective that has gotten us to the place that we're in right now. And so it's really important that we understand our history, that we understand what has happened from the federal government down to state government, all the way down to local government that has impacted the city that we have right now, right? And even the makeup of our neighborhoods, and even where our banks are located, and even related down to our schools. There is so much that has happened at the federal level that has impacted what we have going on right now. And it's really important that we understand that history, one, so that we don't repeat that history, but that we learn from it and we change those policies that we have that may have created the segregation that we may still see present in our city right now. And that little voice that you hear, in case you guys hear a little bit of a baby crying, that is my 8-month-old. She is downstairs. So you might hear a little of that throughout the presentation. And one piece that's really important, and I will constantly encourage everybody around this. We started a DEI book club because we know we wanted to have courageous conversations with Team Norfolk. But again, like I mentioned at the leadership breakfast, we really want to make sure that those courageous conversations also happen in our neighborhoods, also happen among community organizations, also happen on one individual block where neighbors say, you know what, let's all read this book together. Let's start to have conversations. Let's talk about how you interpreted that chapter, because it may be very different than how I interpreted it. And it's through those kind of conversations, that's where change happens. That's where we start to understand folks who may be different than us. That's where we start to understand folks who we thought may be just like us, but really do have many differences than us, right? And so that's where we learn to further understand each other and begin to accept folks for who they are. And so one of the things that this book brings up that I think is just so important for us to understand is that idea of ordinary privilege. And so I mentioned this before at the leadership breakfast, and this really is just, again, as a refresher for those, and then also an introduction for anyone who didn't attend the leadership breakfast. But this idea of ordinary privilege. And with ordinary privilege, it really acknowledges that there are privileges that we all have, right? Advantages that we have. And how do you use any advantage that you have? How do you use it to impact somebody else who doesn't have that same power, or someone who doesn't have that same advantage that you have? One big advantage that everyone on this call has today is that you have internet, you have a computer or a cell phone, and you have connectivity, right? You're able to connect with someone through the internet. And that is not something that all of our neighbors have. And so that is a level of ordinary privilege that you bring to the table. And so what we've seen through this pandemic is that what we may have all thought was just something that everyone had access to, we're learning more and more that access doesn't exist for everyone. And so there are varying levels of ordinary privilege. And the big question is, how are you going to use your ordinary privilege to benefit somebody else? And again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of being able to use something like a book to really drive conversation, as a way to have a conversation starter, as a way to connect with people who you may feel like, I don't know how else to connect with them. But through a book club, it's a very simple way for you to really start to understand someone else, understand their perspectives, and even where they may be coming from. And something else we also shared was that the city is committed to deepening our work and doing the inner work that we must do as your local government. And part of that commitment has been joining the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. We know that we have to address issues of race. Even as of the events of earlier this week, we know that there is a systemic issue that exists in our country. It didn't just start. We are understanding it better because of connectivity, because folks have cell phones, because we have video access. And so we must address issues of racial equity. And so joining the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is really giving us an inside look at what it takes for a government to really start to address issues of race and equity. And how do we prioritize that? And so we're really connecting with other cities who are committed to this work, and really trying to figure out what does it look like to remove systemic barriers. And one thing that I have to just emphasize to folks now that I'm really doing this work is that it's been generations, right, that many of these things have been going on. And so while I know we're all eager to see big change, I know that it's going to take time, right? And we have to be open to the process that we have to go through. We have to be open to some of the pushback that may exist, but know that we as a city, we're committed to removing those barriers. Some of those barriers are glaring in our face, and some of those barriers are not as visible. But part of our work every day, especially in diversity, equity, and inclusion, is starting to poke holes at our policies and really figure out where do we need to do things different so that we can make sure that we are an equitable city, so that we can make sure that we don't have policies in place that are exclusionary, so that we make sure that our citizens know, that our business owners know, and that our visitors know that we are a city that includes everyone, that celebrates diversity, and that advances equity through every decision that we make. And that is our real commitment in the city of Norfolk. And so every day we're plowing away, figuring out how do we do this more? How do we show up in a way so that our citizens know that's what our commitment is? And one of the ways we're doing it is by joining this organization so we can learn. We can learn from other cities who have committed to advancing racial equity. Because again, every week we are seeing more and more of why this work is so important and so necessary. I think there may have been another point in time where folks may have been able to question it more and say, hey, why are you putting so much emphasis on this? Or why is this so important? But I think every day as we watch our news, we can see why it's so important and why it's so necessary that someone wakes up every day looking at the city through this lens, and that they further understand why we have to embed this into every part of our government. But on top of that, why it's so important that you as our neighbors, you as leaders in our city, that you understand our commitment to racial equity, and that you understand that this work doesn't just happen at the city level. This work has to happen in our neighborhoods. It really is going to take all of us. And it's going to take a lot of us calling out things that we see that are happening, using any ordinary privilege that we have to say, hey, that is not right. That is not acceptable. I won't stand for that. That isn't in alignment with who we are as a city. And that's going to take a lot of work from all of us. But joining GARE is one of those pieces that and one of those steps that we've taken as the city of Norfolk. And so we've identified 4 priorities. There are so many areas that we could focus on when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But we recognize that there are 4 key areas where we can put a lot of our resources and our energy. And so those 4 areas are outreach and neighborhood engagement, inclusive economic growth, planning and infrastructure, and human resources and workforce development. And the one area that I want to spend a few minutes talking about today is inclusive economic growth, because we have taken some really dynamic strides in this way. So one of the things that we brought to City Council at the end of 2020 was an economic inclusion plan and procurement policy. And our recommendation to City Council was that we establish goals for how the city spends money, and that we do more spending with minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses. And so based off of the results of the Virginia Beach disparity study that showed that municipalities in this region are not spending significant amounts of money with minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses, we were able to establish a goal. So that holds us accountable as a city for making sure that we spend, of all the money that we're spending on buying paper towels for bathrooms, on buying equipment for employees, or buying materials for our libraries, of all the things that we are purchasing, 12% of all of those purchases must be done with minority-owned businesses, and 13% of all of the ways that the city spends has to be done with women-owned businesses. And so it's one thing to put a goal in place, right? We put a goal in place and then we go put it on the shelf, right? That's the first step of being intentional, right? Is setting the goal. But where we really want to take this a step further is that we are starting the real implementation. And the real implementation for us meant that we have to create some contract opportunities where we are making sure that the opportunity is specifically available to minority-owned companies and women-owned companies. If we're saying that minority-owned companies and women-owned companies were the ones that were right here, right? So if we go back to this idea of equality versus equity, if there are majority white-owned firms or male white-owned firms, perhaps, that are right here, and minority or women-owned firms that are right here, equity is saying you have to do the additional work so that these firms over here get to this level where the other firms are, right? So for us, that looks like what we call sheltered bidding. And so sheltered bidding and sheltered procurement allows us to identify certain contract opportunities where we are only going to accept proposals from minority-owned companies and women-owned companies. So again, if we go back to that description, if we're only making certain proposals or contract opportunities available to minority and women-owned companies, we start to do this. So we allow equity to lead us, right? And so in our effort to advance equity, we're saying those who need more, they get more. They are getting more in this case. We are making sure that we're leveling the playing field by creating a space where folks that are minority or women-owned companies, they're only, for these two contracts, they're only competing with other small minority-owned companies and other small women-owned companies. And so we have the demolition of the McDonald's on St. Paul's Boulevard. That is one of our first sheltered procurements. Not one of them, it's our first sheltered procurement. It closes on April 20th. And so that's the first opportunity where we are only accepting proposals for minority and women-owned companies. And so I really want to make sure we get the word out to our community, because it's one thing for us to create a policy. It's another thing to implement the policy and really go far with it. And so this is our effort at going far. And ultimately, it's not just to go far for this one particular contract, it's to then be of influence to the other municipalities. So if they see Norfolk operating in this capacity, perhaps we'll see more of this happening in the other municipalities. So our intention was to create economic opportunity in the city of Norfolk, but our influence will allow us to challenge other cities to step up and do their part, because that's how we start to really advance equity. And we allow all of those who have been left behind, all of those who have been left out, all of those who have not experienced economic opportunity, they start to do that by us making sure that we are creating opportunities for them, and we are creating a space where they can compete with those who are just like them. And so this is two ways that we're doing this right now, through the demolition contract, again, with the demolition of the McDonald's on St. Paul's Boulevard. And then the second opportunity is a construction management opportunity. You can find details about both of these on our city website, even if you just Google, I think it's contract submissions, and so I took notes on that just to make sure I had the right information. If you Google, sorry guys, if you Google Norfolk current solicitations, you'll see these two opportunities as well as several other opportunities. And so just keep in mind that the city still has this goal, not just for the projects for St. Paul's, but for all projects within the city. And so we want to do more business with minority-owned firms and women-owned firms. And this is us literally putting our money where our mouth is. And so we're hoping that in the future, we'll see more business done with these firms. I can't see you, Jim, but it sounds like did you have a comment, or does somebody have a comment or question?
Yes, I believe Ms. Christopher has a question. You may not be able to see because you have your PowerPoint up, but I think Ms. Christopher has a question. Go ahead, Ms. Christopher.
I wanted to know what happens if it's a Black female. Then is that a double count, or how do you count that?
It's not technically a double count. Generally, when folks register with at the state level for small business and supplier diversity, they may start with their primary designation, which might be a minority small or a women small. It's not as much, I mean, we technically could double count it, but I encourage us when I say us, I'm talking about our chief procurement officer, to challenge ourselves to not just say like, oh, we met the goal because we made sure we hired a Black woman, right? But like that, if we counted in one category, that means you still need to do work in the other category. And so that's the way I'm seeing it, where you don't just, you're not just counting at both places so that you meet the goal faster. We still want to be intentional and make sure that we get as much business from minority-owned firms and women-owned firms, right? Rather than trying to find every loophole so that we kill two birds with one stone, right? And so on the scoring matrix, the thought is that, well, let me just go back for a second. With a sheltered procurement, you are only being able to bid on it if you are a minority or women-owned firm, right? So we're not going to have extra points in there for being a minority or women-owned firm. That's the only way that you can bid on this opportunity, right? So we've already leveled the playing field there. This just means that we will count it in one of the two categories. It means that we would need to do work in one of the other categories to make sure that we still meet the goal. But the goal wouldn't be just to count it twice, because then that way we're not making sure that enough people are getting access to economic opportunity. Does that answer your question, Ms. Christopher? I'm sorry, I can't see you, so I don't know. I can escape my PowerPoint though.
Yes,
So
that
yes.
does. Thank you very
Thanks, Ms.
much.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Alita.
Yeah, and I know other places they where they may have set aside, they kind of like, oh, we can count it twice, and I don't know that really gets at what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to do the most good for the most number of people, right? And so doing the most good means that we aren't just kind of trying to figure out how we check the boxes so that we look good and we count you twice. Instead, we want to make sure that we are doing the most good, so we have more women-owned companies and more minority-owned companies, more women of color bidding on projects. And so that's where I kind of come in and push us and challenge us not to just kind of check a box and say, hey, we met our goal because we hired an Indian woman to do X, Y, Z, but instead saying, that means we need to go a little bit further because maybe we may count that opportunity as a women-owned business, and we need to do more work to reach more ethnic minorities, and so I think there's room and opportunity for us to just really push it, and for me to push us as a city to do the most good, not just do good and check a box. And so what I have here is just a definition, the definition of intentional, and then some synonyms for intentional, right? Because it really will require, and I appreciate your question because it really does get at this, done on purpose and deliberate. And so if we want to be very deliberate about creating economic opportunity, then we won't, as a city, find the loopholes. We'll instead constantly work to do the most good. And so other synonyms for intentionality are conscious, intended, knowing. If we know that we can do more, we should be doing more, right? And so my entire job is pushing us in that direction and moving us to a place where everyone thinks in this way, right? And so that's the real work. And that's the real work that I encourage for each of you as you lead your neighborhoods, is that you are intentional about being diverse, about celebrating the diversity in your community, that you're intentional about being equitable, and that you're being intentional about being inclusive for everyone who is there. And so I want to pose that question to you. How are you being intentional about diversity, equity, and inclusion in your neighborhood? And what I want to do for a second is I want to stop sharing my screen so that I can see everyone, because I like to take a second and just have this conversation around how are we being intentional about being diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And I want to open it up to everyone. And don't all speak at one time.
Oh, I'll start. Well, the one thing I do, I try to speak to everybody that I know is in the neighborhood. While it's kind of difficult because I'm on a corner where the nursing home is, so we get everybody coming and going in the neighborhood because they're visitor or whatnot. But just trying to make sure if someone new moves in, at least saying hello if it's someone new on the block. And we're in the middle of two civic leagues, but at least telling them about the opportunity to join the civic league, because we are on Colonial Place on one side and Riverview on the other, and I found out that actually belong to, we couldn't actually belong until I kept asking questions. And so now we are welcomed in the Civic League. But just trying to make sure you're friendly to people makes a big difference.
That makes a huge difference. Thank you so much for sharing that. That really does make a huge difference. And I think you hit the nail on the head with like even asking questions, right? That goes so far. One question can really take you, I don't mean this in a negative way, but can take you down a rabbit hole, right? Where you really start to find out a lot of information about a person or about a situation or about an organization or about the civic league or about the neighborhood, you know, and it really does start with that question. So thank you. Anybody else want to share? And so the question again is, how are you being intentional about diversity, equity, and inclusion in your neighborhood?
This is Philip Hawkins speaking. I wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Charlene said, Ms. Chris, about the Civic League. That's the organization that I'm a part of in my neighborhood. I'm actually on the board with the Ingleside Civic League, and we do a variety of things in our community to try to include everybody. We've been using the social media platforms, of course, because of COVID, but even before COVID, we were utilizing Nextdoor. And so we do have a team of members from the Civic League who actually intentionally reach out to new residents who join Nextdoor, and we reach out and you know, greet them. And we also have with our membership committee within the Civic League, we have like welcome packets that we give to new residents. So we have our ambassadors on our board who actually kind of know when new people move in, so we can, like Ms. Charlene said, it's good to just be friendly. You don't have to know someone to just speak to them, or, you know, just when you see them, just smile. A lot of times when people see you smiling, they may say, oh, okay, they're friendly because they haven't, you know, the nonverbal language, our body language tells, you know, gives off first impressions. So that's one thing we do, but we also have a community day that we were doing before COVID, Inglefest. That's a diverse celebration of our neighborhood. So we bring in the churches, we bring in the nonprofits, we bring in the schools, other civic associations, the city, and we have a 4-hour festival once a year in the summer, just to celebrate the community. We come together. It's very family oriented. Anyone is welcome. It's no charge to come and just meet and greet neighbors. So I think we just need to continue to do that in all of our neighborhoods, you know, and just celebrate the diversity and equity and being inclusive. I want to also say, you know, we also include people to join the Civic League, and they can even become leaders in the Civic League. They don't have to, you know, they could join and then they can quickly get to work in our Civic League. We don't have any requirements that they have to be a member for so long to just start doing things in our community, because it belongs to all of us. Thank you.
That was incredible. And that last piece is spot on, right? So thank you very much, Mr. Hawkins, for sharing that, especially that last piece. I just want to dive in there for a second. I have talked to a few other local organizations and groups, and one thing that I often ask is, have you asked people to join? You know, when they say like, oh, there's nobody that wants to join, or our group doesn't look like our residents, or isn't reflective. And so a very simple question of, have you asked them? Or have you made assumptions about the type of person who is the right fit for your board, right? Or have you made assumptions about who would want to get engaged? Do you only think that homeowners want to be involved? Or do you only think that people who look like you, whatever that looks like, are the ones who want to get engaged? Or those who speak fluent English are the only ones who want to get engaged? You know, we have all these assumptions about people, right? And so sometimes we don't even ask them. We haven't even invited them in. We have not created a space where they can be a part of it. And so everything that you said is spot on. And part of the simple things that we can do is ask folks, tell them about the opportunity and ask them. there are so many times where folks thought that they may have asked me to be involved. They may have talked about the opportunity, but they never asked me if I wanted to participate, you know? And sometimes people just need to be asked. They need to know that you actually want them to be a part. And we don't always do that. We make assumptions too often, whether consciously or unconsciously. And so that's why I really want to emphasize this piece about being intentional. And it sounds like you guys are being intentional. And that's what it's going to take, right? That's what it's going to take for us to even have more unity within our neighborhoods. And for the neighborhoods that that aren't reflective of what you're talking about, they're going to need to hear from folks like you, right? They're going to need to know, like, oh, I need to ask. Oh, I didn't know I needed to ask. I thought that putting the flyer out there meant that people were just going to join. Well, if people haven't felt comfortable, if you haven't created a sense of belonging or made them feel like they were a part, how could they ever think that you want them there, especially if you haven't asked them? And so it's the simple things. It's the simple things that lead to the results that we're talking about, but it really does take being intentional. Thinking back to what the city is doing, right? Our city efforts are to economic inclusion. It's layers to that intention. It's like we could have just stopped at a goal and said, hey, but we have a goal. No, that next layer was going deeper, right? And so how can you in your neighborhood, and I'm gonna share the presentation again, but how can you in your neighborhood, wherever you guys are, whatever layer of diversity, equity, inclusion you guys are exploring, how do you go deeper? How do you go deeper from where you are to make sure that everyone is being included? And what I want to do, I want to just jump right here because I think this will speak to it. And I think I'm sharing my screen. Current thought. At the last presentation, at the leadership breakfast, we talked about, and I'm jumping around a little bit just because I want to get to this part, the equity checklist and using an equity checklist to drive decision making, right? And so related to community engagement, one of the things that, as a resource that we received from GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, when they talk about community engagement, it's constantly asking who hasn't been engaged, who hasn't been added, and then you add those people, and then you still ask again, right? And so what we do too often, and you know, we're guilty of it in the city as well, is that we ask that one time, who hasn't been engaged? And we're like, oh, so-and-so hasn't been engaged, or this group hasn't been engaged. And then we try to engage those folks and we don't keep asking. But where I want you guys to be very intentional and where we need to do more work to be intentional is that you keep asking that question. It's like always thinking, how do I get down to the lowest common denominator? How do I keep making sure that no one is left out? It takes so much intention, and it takes constantly asking, how do we keep folks engaged? Who wasn't included last time? Did we make sure that we went over to that apartment complex? We know those 3 houses on 34th Street are rental houses. Did we ask them? Did we include them? I know we asked Miss So-and-so because we know she owns her home, right? And we know she really cares about this block. But did we ask the other folks? Or did we ask that apartment complex? Or did we ask that landlord who drives us nuts because they don't do X, Y, Z, right? And so community engagement and intentional diversity, equity, and inclusion is the constant asking, right? It's re-engaging. It's re-engaging the person who you may have invited last year or 2 years ago and inviting them again, right? And giving them another opportunity to get involved. And so, so thank you for everything that you guys have shared. And so I want to, let me see if I can go back one slide. Nope, not letting me go back one slide. Okay. And so here are 3 ways that you can, if you kind of feel like I don't really know what we could be doing, here are just 3 things, right? And so I think what you guys have shared, even just smiling at someone, right? Or just asking them a simple question or inviting them to get involved as soon as they come into the neighborhood, not expecting them to jump through hoops or be a resident for a year or come to 5 meetings or come to 8 meetings, you know? Not making folks jump through hoops to get involved and not assuming that certain folks don't want to be involved based off of their status, whether that status is parent, single parent, elderly person, young person, college student, high school student, not making assumptions about the level of participation they want to have, and then instead asking them and constantly saying, who's been left out? Who didn't we include? Who didn't we engage with? Who didn't we do outreach to? And so it really does take that. And so under diversity, one of the ways that you can be intentional is celebrating the diversity of your neighbors, asking questions. And so I'm so glad that, Ms. Christopher, you said that before you even see the slide, right? So that's already a step you're taking. Ask questions to further understand them. And something I just want to point out, I think sometimes we think because someone looks like us that they are just like us. And what you guys may have heard a lot on the news lately is that African Americans aren't a monolith, and this group isn't a monolith, and Asian Americans aren't a monolith. And that is so true. We aren't all the same, even if we may look alike. Myself and another woman who is my same age and has the same background as me, we would still be different people, right? And so we can't make assumptions about people, even if they may look like us or even if they may have some of the characteristics we have. It's still worth it to ask folks questions because that's how you get to know them and their lived experiences. And that's where you start to really share and build those deeper connections. So I just want to make sure I put a pin in that piece. And then equity, using the equity checklist, the one I just had up on the screen, to help with your neighborhood-based decision-making. And then inclusion, creating a sense of belonging among all your neighbors. And to do this, it requires practice and it requires effort and it requires doing it again and again, right? You might feel like you're beating a dead horse, but what I've learned is, and something that a terminology that they use in marketing is that you have to say something to someone 7 times for them to hear it 1 time. Have you reached out 7 times to a neighbor, inviting them to participate? If you think about that, they don't hear it, it doesn't translate in their brain until they've heard it 7 times. Have you done that? Have you reached out 7 times, right? And so it requires practice, it requires effort, and it requires being intentional. And so again, this is the equity checklist. These are the questions you ask in the various categories from what is the decision that you're trying to make, right? That's the proposal piece. And then data, what's the data? And sometimes we don't have the data, but what data do you have? Maybe you have demographic information about your neighborhood, or maybe you know about income levels of your neighborhood, or whatever data you have or whatever data you could possibly obtain through the city, using that to help you with your decisions you're making. And then that community engagement piece that we just talked about. And then this piece is very important and something that we are trying to use to help us make decisions, who will benefit and who will burden. Because what we know to be true is that the same folks are always benefiting, and too often the same folks are burdened. And so that may be true in your neighborhood as well. If you're making decisions based off of homeowners, or you're making decisions based off of renters, or you're making decisions based off of 2-family incomes, right? Sometimes we make decisions based off of and out of our own privilege, right? Sometimes we make decisions based off of having internet connectivity, right? Sometimes we make decisions based off of not having small children. You ever see an invite for something, and this is also, it's pre-COVID, you ever see an invite for something and you look at it and you're like, they must not want somebody like me to attend, right? Like if somebody had something, I had an 8-month-old, if they had it at a certain time of day, or if they had it late in the evening, or if they had it on, a certain day of the week, I would assume, based off of some of those factors, maybe they didn't want someone like me to attend, right? Based off of what I would need to be able to participate as someone who has a very small child, right? And so think about that. Think about your decisions within your neighborhood from the perspective of others, right? And like what it would take for them to feel included in your decision making. And so I hope you find some of this to be helpful. I want to talk about this idea of being an influencer. And so we often hear the term influencer, and some of these images might come to your mind when you think about an influencer, right? We use the term influencer often to refer to social media, right? Someone who has a presence online. Maybe they have a podcast. Maybe they use Twitter. Maybe they're really active on Nextdoor, or they have a blog, right? Or they do TikTok videos, a number of things, right? But this idea of influencers, I want to turn this concept of an influencer on its head a bit, but I want to start with the definition out of Merriam-Webster. An influencer, one who exerts influence, a person who inspires or guides the actions of others. And anyone who is on this call on a Wednesday evening, when it's nice and a nice spring-like night, you are an influencer. You're a person who inspires or guides the action of others. One, because you've taken the step to be present here this evening to figure out how you can do more in your neighborhood. And so what I want to encourage for you is to become and really be a Norfolk neighborhood influencer. And so I'm going to break down this idea of an influencer. And hopefully if you're taking notes that as we go through each of these, you'll identify yourself, you'll see areas where you're excelling, and maybe you'll also identify some areas where you might want to do a little work, right? Or you may look at it through the lens of your civic league or your nonprofit organization and say, hey, is my nonprofit organization, is my civic league, am I being a Norfolk neighborhood influencer? And so I just want you to kind of look at this, something that we've come up with in our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office. And I hope it encourages you as we think about being intentional and being influential in everything that we do to advance equity. And so a Norfolk neighborhood influencer does these things, right? And so I'll just walk through each of these. They're intentional. They're intentionally supporting neighborhood businesses. I can't emphasize enough the importance of supporting small local companies. What we know about small local companies is that when you spend with them, that money stays in your neighborhood, it stays within our city, it supports people who work in our city and work in our region, right? And so someone who is a Norfolk neighborhood influencer, you're supporting neighborhood businesses. You're supporting your small local companies. And so that's something I want to challenge all of us to do. We're doing our part at the city level by making sure that we're spending with minority and women-owned companies, but the real need is going to be met by each of us doing our part in neighborhoods with smaller companies, with minority-owned companies, with women-owned companies, spending our money locally. And then you nominate your neighbors for awards. Have you ever been nominated for something, or someone has highlighted or affirmed you based off of seeing something positive that you've done? What's the one thing that happens when someone does that? And I can't see you guys, so I'm just going to chime right in. What I know that happens is that it makes somebody want to do more, right? It makes someone to lean in. It makes someone to get more involved. When we think about our young people, when we acknowledge that they were volunteering for the street cleanup, and you maybe nominate them for an award and they receive that award, they may be more inclined next time to get involved. They're like, oh, wait, they noticed what I did. They appreciated what I did. What I did added value. And so to be a neighborhood influencer, you're someone who nominates your neighbors for awards. And so there's so many award opportunities that happen through our neighborhood development department, our neighborhood services department, and specifically neighborhood engagement, and all my colleagues who are on this call, where I hope you are encouraged to constantly think about how you can nominate your neighbors, because it really does create opportunities for them to lean in further and want to do more, right? So I encourage you guys to do that. A neighborhood influencer finds creative solutions to neighborhood challenges. I know we all may have had a neighbor now or in the past that complains, right? But what about those neighbors who find solutions? I hope all of us are the folks who are finding solutions. I hope our organizations, and by organizations I mean civic leagues or nonprofits or PTAs or whoever, I hope you are working to be solution-based versus just kind of complaining about what the city isn't doing, what this group isn't doing, what this segment of the population isn't doing or is doing, and instead you're being solution-driven. An influencer learns about your neighbors, and we've talked a bit about that, and it all starts with asking a question, finding out more about them. And then an influencer understands the demographics of the neighborhood. The more you understand the demographics of your neighborhood, that'll help you when you look at that decision-making, using equity to make decisions, right? And so you understand the demographics. Maybe you start to do some research so that you better understand the demographics of your neighborhood and why your neighborhood has the makeup that it has. And so I'd encourage that for each of you. And then also, you encourage board recruitment for renters and homeowners. You know, I've been a renter, right? And so I've known what it felt like for someone to almost otherize you, like, oh, you're a renter, versus like, oh, you're a homeowner, you know? And so people can tell when they're left out. If we ever took some time to kind of sit and talk and say, name a time when you felt left out and how did it make you feel? people do not like to feel left out, right? And so whether we're doing it intentionally or subconsciously, it has an impact. And so if you're going to be a neighborhood influencer, you're encouraging board recruitment. You're not like Mr. Hawkins said, you're not waiting for somebody to attend 15 meetings or, you know, jump up and down, do a backflip to get involved and to then decide that they're worth some recruitment effort from you so that they can join your board or your organization, right? You're encouraging that right away. You're nurturing new neighbors, just like Ms. Christopher said, right? Saying hello, asking a question, whether you know if they're a new neighbor or not, you're starting to engage them. And if they are your new neighbor, engage them early. Engage them early so they can get involved and create space and opportunities. And ask them to participate, ask them to get involved. And then you connect neighbors with resources like this academy. I think this is such a useful resource. And I think we got to find ways for more folks to take advantage of it and really get involved with it. So you connect neighbors with your resources. Two of those resources you gathered today was the economic inclusion policy and then the specific shelter procurement opportunities that we have right now for minority companies and women-owned companies. And so I challenge you and encourage you to connect your neighbors with these types of resources. And then you employ an equity checklist in neighborhood decision-making. You guys saw a previous slide with the equity checklist. You use that when you're making decisions for your neighborhood, or you're making decisions for your street, or you're making decisions around having a summer program for the kids, right? Or whatever it may be. But you use that equity checklist to help you with the decision-making so that you make sure that you're using data, and you make sure that you're engaging the community, and you make sure that you're asking who experiences the benefit and who experiences the burden, you know? And so that's the benefit of an equity checklist, because it makes you be intentional about the pieces that really do matter. And then the last piece of being an influencer, you raise questions to promote inclusion and belonging. The only way folks feel like they belong is that you have included them. You've invited them in. And so think about who hasn't been included, who hasn't been invited to participate, who haven't you reached out to, who didn't receive a smile from you or someone else in their neighborhood, and make that extra effort. And so with all of those efforts, you too will be a Norfolk neighborhood influencer. And so I really encourage that for each of us. And I hope we can start to share this out and let this be a charge to us of how we move forward, right? And like, these are steps that we can take and ways that we can revisit to see where we are, where are we kind of falling short, and where can we make more of an effort. And so I'll just share again what are our next steps as the City of Norfolk. I'll go right to the last one. How do we apply an equity lens? And most importantly, as we make decisions in the City of Norfolk, who is experiencing the benefit and who is experiencing the burden? Because way too often, the same folks get to benefit and the same folks are burdened, and that is not advancing equity. And so our work every day is making sure that we change this. And so that is our commitment here in the City of Norfolk, because Norfolk does welcome everyone, and everyone needs to feel like that. And until everyone feels like that, we've got a lot of work to do. So thank you, guys. Here's my contact information in case you want to reach out or connect in any way. And I look forward to joining you guys in the future. I will stop sharing at this time.
Thanks, Aaliyah. I can promise you all that you're going to see that influencer acronym a lot more in the next year, and the equity checklist. I think our team, I'm sure, thought that was great, and we are going to use that a lot more in the future, I'm sure. Are there any questions out there for Leah?
This isn't so much just a question, but just to kind of comment on your equity and equality slide. As a former special ed teacher, could you put some railings up for that little handicapped child so he don't fall off the steps?
Got it. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
It was very good. Thank you.
Certainly.
This is Philip again. I have a question. So Ms. Wilson, are you available to come to Civic Leagues to do like an abbreviated version or of this presentation? I think it's excellent. And I would love to see this come to Ingleside, even though we have been practicing diversity and inclusion and, you know, equity in how we promote the neighborhood and support our residents and neighbors and include everybody. But I think as the neighborhood continues to turn over, we have new residents that move in, and we're going through that transition now. We have a lot of new residents, and many new residents may not know the older residents. So I think it is good to refresh, even, because the generations are changing. And then you have a whole new group of residents in our neighborhoods, and they may not know anybody, or like you said, connecting people or neighbors to resources. That's important. Like that was one example. My next door neighbor, she moved in September last year, but she didn't know which day to set her trash cans out or the rules. And so I kind of introduced myself in a nice way and, just gave her some information, and she was on next door, and I said, hi, and, we became connected that way, just reaching out to offer help or, like you said, ask a question. But your presentation was awesome. So I think we need to bring it to every civic league in the city.
Yes,
not just work you to death though. Maybe train us on, train the civic leaders to be able to implement the the ideals and the vision of the city, because it's definitely what we need.
And I think you hit the nail on the head with that piece. I think it really is about creating more ambassadors, right? And so it would be wonderful if we did a training with the folks that are on here, and then you took that information to your civic league. Maybe I come and do a quick intro and say, hi, I have endorsed Philip. Philip will go forth and he will be your trainer, right? And so then that way it lives within your neighborhood, right? Like you don't need me to do it. It needs to live with you. It needs to live with you then training other folks. So it just becomes part of like how we exist, right? Versus like living with one person. And so I think that's the way you do it. And I think that's something we should really look into. So thank you, certainly.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions out there or comments?
Yes, hi, this is Barbara Dolge of Bruce's Park Civic League. Is this presentation online?
It is not, but I think we could get it on there. I'll turn it over to my colleagues in neighborhood engagement.
Okay, thank you. That would be very helpful. Then that way we could go over it for ourselves. And not to say that we still won't need to be trained, but at least we'll get more familiar.
We will
totally. And I think that,
Okay, thank you.
We will definitely put the recording on YouTube. We will put the presentation there. We may even create a separate page just for this and I think I'll work with our team to maybe turn some of those, the neighborhood influencer into a flyer itself or a graphic, maybe even do a survey online and maybe create a page just for this. But I'd also ask that you continue to share your success stories with us, because like Aaliyah said, that is just as influential, in changing habits and behavior as, PowerPoint presentations. So continue to turn in your success stories to us. We'd appreciate that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Aaliyah.
No, you're fine. You're good.
I was going to say, Jimmy sent us an email with 2 resources in preparation for this, and very interesting. I don't know if Aaliyah, you spearheaded us getting this dashboard or whatever, but I wanted to know, like the dashboard that you sent us, that link, is that something that we should be keeping to ourselves, or is that shareable to our communities to sort of even look at?
Which dashboard went out? I'm sorry. I don't know.
Yeah, Aaliyah may not know. It's the dashboard with the WebEx link. I sent the dashboard, the city's diversity dashboard, and I sent a link to your page.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. Yes, that is public information. So that is on our open data platform. So that gets updated via PeopleSoft. So as our city employee demographics change, that is updating on a regular. And so that is the city's effort at being transparent about this. And so, yes, that is public. We want people to know, because that's how you hold us accountable. If you look and see, and I go on it from time to time, sometimes I can't sleep or I'm up with the baby in the middle of the night, I'll check it out. And I look and I see salaries of African American women, right? Or I see salaries of African American men of a certain age. And I'm reminded of what the work that we need to do. And I'll be very transparent. I'll look at some of our departments, I'll look at planning and be reminded that there is work we need to do in our planning department, right? And so there's a transparency that we are creating where we're showing where we currently exist and where we have a lot of work to do. And so you have access to it. Everybody has access to it. So you see where we currently are. And you can also see even the number of, compared to some other cities that I know, we have more women in senior leadership positions than some other cities, and that should be celebrated, you know? And so, but there's also work that we have to do in our fire department and, you know, and in our police department and in our utilities department, where we actually have laborers who may not be making wages that are in alignment with who we say we are as a city. And so all of that information is public. Share it. It holds us accountable, and it allows us to be better.
I was going to say, like, you know, as sort of like a data nerd in that way, that I realized that, you know, essentially, if we took out the police department, women are really powering the city, except for in two spaces, development and I think it was home assessments, which kind of makes sense in a way. But I think that's where a lot of us structure, and I'm looking at Miss Barbara, as communities that are coming together where we find, hey, like the development piece, something's missing here. And maybe it's a woman's touch. Just like, but no, I'm grateful. Thank you for that data. It's really useful.
And please share it widely and hold us accountable for it. So, yep.
This is Philip again. I have another question. With respect to this presentation, has this been offered to the Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority communities? Because I know that, well, especially we're in the process of the transformation with St. Paul's, and you did allude to the economic opportunities for minorities, women and minorities with the, you know, with the businesses in terms of opportunities and demolition and, you know, just stages of that process that's about to you know, in different phases. But I think would be a great opportunity, you know, probably engage those citizens in those neighborhoods. I do work in St. Paul's at the senior elementary school. So I know many families go through TMZ offices, or, you know, try to set up some engagement sessions if that's possible virtually, or work even collaboratively with the Norfolk Public Schools, because we can reach the families because the kids come to school virtually or hybrid, you know, in person. So just another thought. I didn't know if the city is looking at that opportunity. That would be great.
Yeah, so to fully answer your question, so part of we have an economic inclusion task force, and it includes urban strategies. So they are running People First. So Nicole Todd from Urban Strategies and People First is on our economic inclusion task force. And then also NRHA, Kim Thomas with NRHA is also on our economic inclusion task force. So they have been involved with our entire process of us getting our economic inclusion policy approved through City Council. And so the word does go out to our public housing communities. What I know to be very true is that for these two specific opportunities, they are more designed for companies that have been in business, right? To take on this level of work, there's a certain capacity. I don't want to go too deep in economic development, but there's a certain level or capacity of work that you have to be able to do, right? But what we have been arguing, and not necessarily arguing, but fighting for, is that we identify low barrier to entry opportunities. What does that mean? So when someone has a limited income or may not already be in business, there are some businesses that you can start with little amounts of money, right? And that's for anyone. And this is just like I'm giving this part away for free. Lawn care, that's a company that you can start where you don't have a large startup cost, right? Or janitorial company. That's another business you can start where you have low startup costs, right? And so there are several companies that you can begin where you don't have to have significant amount of startup costs. And so we're really encouraging our residents to look into these low barrier to entry businesses where it doesn't take a lot for you to get into the industry, right, or to get into that type of business. And we're trying to make sure that with our redevelopment project that we're identifying opportunities where we carve out smaller contracts. I call it debundling, right? And so that was one of the things I shared with City Council. We want to debundle larger contracts. So if we had a large landscaping contract as a part of St. Paul's, what I am saying is that we need to have significantly smaller opportunities. So if you're just a two-person shop, you can take a piece of work that is in alignment with what you could fulfill, right? And rather than trying to say that a small company needs to get this large contract that they can't fulfill, we create smaller opportunities. So you start to build economic growth, right, for yourself and for your business with little startup costs. And so that's some of the stuff that we're looking at in conjunction with some of the larger contracts like the demolition contract or the construction management opportunity. And I know I went into the weeds a little bit with that one, so my apologies, but I hope that kind of answered it and kind of explained a little bit about it. Did I lose anyone? That explanation.
That was good. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.